Much, Dan, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Now the world is reopening. There are many other things you could be doing on a Thursday night. We are thrilled to have you here. Thank you to everyone joining us on the live stream. On behalf of Katrina and myself, we'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and there has still been no treaty, which means Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are not only the traditional but also the rightful owners of so-called Australia. It is my absolute pleasure and a privilege to be helping you launch this book tonight. My friend Katrina. I'm going to read you her professional bio before I tell you what a good friend of mine she is. Katrina Marson has been researching the protective power of sex ed to prevent sexual violence and safeguard sexual well-being for a decade. She has been a criminal lawyer since 2013, primarily in the areas of family violence and sexual offences. On secondment for 2 years, Katrina led the implementation of the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission's criminal justice recommendations in the ACT before returning to the ACT DPP as a senior prosecutor in the Sexual Offences Unit. She undertook a Churchill Fellowship in 2019, researching the implementation of relationships and sexuality education overseas. She is the lead of primary prevention at Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy, RASARA, the organisation, and is the president of the Relationships and Sexuality Education Alliance in the ACT. Please make her very welcome. So you and I first met on Zoom, which, you know, is how a lot of people meet these days, unfortunately. But it was when I was researching for a piece in the Monthly. And that was a couple of years ago now, I suppose. Yep. And we are now friends and hang out all the time. But what I want to start with is something I've noticed about a lot of the people in our field, some of the legends who are here tonight, Saxon Mullins and Rachel Bergen. Also a huge round of applause, actually, for the people changing the world. Is that a lot of us in anything sort of remotely connected to this space start with the criminal law side of things and then end up working in trying to improve, caring a lot about the educational side of things. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of journey in your professional trajectory before we start talking specifically about your fantastic book?
Sure, and I think it's a really good and important place to start is...
Are you on?
Am I on? Is this working?
Just turn the switch up.
Just switch it on.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it's an important place to start, I think, well, for me personally, in terms of how I arrived at writing this book. And it's a similar trajectory, as you've said, for many who work in this space. If you start with the criminal law, you very quickly learn how limited the criminal justice system's response can be to something like sexual violence. Necessarily so, because it is reactive by nature. It only steps in once something has already happened, one case at a time, and even then it only steps in for some people. There are some people who will never be able to seek justice through the criminal law, through choice or for other reasons. So you very quickly, well for me, very quickly become frustrated with its limited capacity to actually do anything to stop the cases that come to the courtroom steps, and you start to look for other solutions that might stop the harm from happening in the first place. And usually you will arrive at the point of education at some point in that interrogation.
I think it's so incredible that you've written this book whilst having a extremely demanding and frankly upsetting full-time job. That is a feat. That is a marathon whilst also running a marathon. And the way I think about your work, and one of the reasons I have so much admiration for it, is because I feel like on a daily basis you're doing that sort of, yes, reactionary, but also extremely importantly responsive work on a sort of individual case-by-case basis in sort of all meanings of the word case. But I feel like with this book, this is the ripples in the pond thing. This is the big picture. This is the intergenerational, foundational, transformative change for the country level of stuff. It's just fantastic. Can you talk about what a Churchill Fellowship is for those who've never heard of the term before, and then specifically what yours was?
Certainly. So a Churchill Fellowship is a research grant that is offered. There's a Churchill Fellowship that operates in the UK, here and in New Zealand. They're all separate, and they effectively fund you to conduct research overseas. If you can show them that there's a subject or an area that they're doing something really well overseas that we could learn from here in Australia, then if you can convince them, they will give you the funds to go and research that and bring those lessons back. So I think their tagline is learn globally, inspire locally. So it's about going to get that practical experience and lessons from other parts of the world, and how can we adopt that here. So for me, my subject was about the implementation of relationships and sexuality education overseas. In Australia, we have, I think inconsistent is the best way to describe sex ed in this country, even still. So obviously, because education is the purview of the states and territories, the federal government still plays some role, but it's a real patchwork quilt. We've got you've got private, public, Catholic, different streams of education. So it's really inconsistent, and what that means is that young Australians cannot be guaranteed access to comprehensive relationships and sexuality education by any stretch. Some young Australians are getting that. But what I saw overseas was that some countries actually guarantee it. To some extent, they treat it as a right that young people have this education. And so that's what I wanted to understand, was how come we fall down here in Australia at the stage of getting it implemented in schools. So we've got a lot of really good research in Australia, great researchers that have demonstrated the importance of relationships and sexuality education, why it works, what it should look like, and yet it's not in every classroom, and not every young Australian is getting it. How are we falling down at that point? So that's what I wanted to go and see overseas.
And where did you go?
So I went to 5 countries across Europe and North America. I went to Ireland, England, the Netherlands, Germany, Canada, and then I stopped off in Chicago on the way back. I think it must be said that the fact that my research was so Eurocentric is a deficiency in it. There's a lot of really good work in the sex research space that comes out of South and Central America, Africa. So there is some really good work that comes out of there that would have really improved my research.
Next time.
Hopefully. I wish you could do a round 2 Churchill Fellowship.
Something I remember distinctly from that very first time that I was sort of interviewing you and had never met you was when you explained the difference between that you don't sort of endorse a particular program, but you're interested in how to make effective implementation. That was quite a sort of watershed moment for me. Can you explain that distinction and I guess what you really care about and what you're specifically trying to get?
I don't know where to start with my answer to that. But maybe if I can start from the point of view that a lot of these countries I went to, that they had, was that recognising that this is a matter of public wellbeing, this is a matter of public policy, a public health issue. It's not an individual issue. It's kind of like if you think about the COVID response, it can't just be left to individual people. It's a community-wide response that's demanded. And so when you take that perspective, that this is something more infrastructural than just this one teacher, this one classroom, this one private program, private provider of sex ed, then you start to focus less on the actual curriculum or resource or material that's being delivered and a little bit more on the structure that allows comprehensive sex ed to be rolled out, because there are so many great programs that already exist. There are great teachers already doing good work. Why would we want to come in and clear the field of all of that to kind of roll in and do something that we've decided is the right sex ed? And we can certainly decide what is good sex ed, what are the great minimum standards that you would want to have for comprehensive sex ed. But we don't need to come in and wipe the slate clean when there's great work already being done. What we need to do is clear the way for some of this infrastructural stuff to get put in place so that all teachers are trained to feel confident in delivering good sex ed, that parents are feeling engaged and that they have the resources and information they need to continue the conversation at home, that school principals feel supported by their education department so they don't think they're going to get this backlash from in the media, in the tabloids about it. So it's those kind of bigger picture structural things that we need to focus on if we're ever going to guarantee young Australians comprehensive RSE.
Your book opens with a Respect Day visit to the students from several schools in May 2021 during what you refer to as a storm of public concern. You've been doing this work for years before that storm. I want to know, I'm so curious to hear, like, when that storm started and was blowing a gale, what surprised you and what didn't surprise you about seeing this thing that you had just been doing solid work on for so long explode in the public consciousness?
What has surprised me, and a really pleasant surprise, is how the public attention on the issue has sustained since May. I mean, this was May 2021, but the storm, I think it started probably around 2018.
Maybe.
We're both looking at Saxon. And, you know, even Saxon's advocacy stands on the shoulders of so many who've come before, and many of those whose stories we don't hear, as I say in the book, in the sort of national consciousness and storytelling. Survivors of sexual violence are not homogenous, even though those that we hear about often are. So it has been bubbling along for decades, as you say. But then we started to see this increased attention. Media was giving it continued airtime, and that has persisted, and that has surprised me in a good way. I'm glad that the pressure has not relented, and that is in part thanks to the advocacy of people in this room, yourself included, Bri. So that's surprised me. What hasn't surprised me about it? I think the public consciousness turning to something like education as a response to the issue of sexual violence, that hasn't surprised me. That's happened every time something's cropped up in the community discussion. It's just that bit of the conversation has gotten louder and been more sustained, and more people are starting to understand and draw that connection between the rates of sexual violence and a deficiency in what knowledge and information and skills we're giving young people from, you know, RSE is a lifelong journey, so from a young age all the way through to university and beyond.
Actually, it might be good to backtrack for a moment here. What is, when you say RSE, what do you mean by that? And for people in the room who are not familiar with this terminology, what do you mean in particular by like age-appropriate RSE?
Sure. So when we say comprehensive relationships and sexuality education, we don't mean condoms on bananas and no means no. That's not what we mean. We're talking about a really holistic education program that starts from a young age, starts with concepts like bodily autonomy, communication skills. It's best perhaps if I illustrate with an example. In the Netherlands, one of the programs they run with really young kids, they start with exercises where, for example, they will get the kids to touch different materials against their skin, so like feathers, steel wool, sponges, and the kids have to articulate how that makes them feel. So they actually have to sit with that physical feeling, talk about it, give voice to it. Those sorts of activities is what we mean when we say age appropriate, or in, I don't know why.
Oh, it's just your hair. It's fine. Carol from Bravehearts once said to me, and I use this everywhere I go now, they can talk to kindergarten-age children, and it's about bodily autonomy and clear communication, and they just teach them from my head to my toes, I say what goes.
Yeah, and even earlier than kindergarten.
Yeah.
You know, we're from day one, just starting to introduce ideas of autonomy and consent and communication, and similar to from my head to my toes, I say what goes. In the UK, there was a little song chant thing that they were teaching kids who were 4 or 5 about their mouth, their chest, their penis, vagina, bottom. No one can touch or look at it if they're not comfortable with it. and just getting the kids to sort of absorb that message and repeat it. And we started to see, it's interesting in terms of the age appropriateness, we start to see the shame kick in quite early. About kindergarten, year 1, the giggles start. And you don't see that in the younger classes, in the nursery classes, you don't see that. But a little bit older and you're already starting to see the discomfort with using the names of genitals, the correct terminology for it. And so then the educators have a method for sort of getting young people more comfortable with it and explaining that it's just like nose, chin, elbow, knees. It's just the words that we use. So I think I've gone off on a tangent.
No, it's perfect. It's great.
How do we end up with milkshakes?
Yeah, I wasn't going to say the word milkshake tonight.
I have a real problem with food analogies.
Yes,
sex,
all right. Coming back to the book, you start one of, you give one example of a school visit, and that's something that both of us have done. One thing that you mention in the beginning of this school visit is that you ask the students, how many of you think I'm here to scare you straight? Can you explain why that approach to, like, I guess, trying to just scare them into no sex at all or not talking about, like, why doesn't that work? And what do we know about what does work?
Look, I'm not a psychologist, but generally scaring people and shaming people into action doesn't work across so many areas, and this is just another example. We know that holistic, positive, well-being based messaging is far more effective when it comes to relationships and sexuality education, safeguarding our own and each other's sexual well-being. The evidence bears that out time and again. So I'm inclined to rely on the evidence and not be, I suppose, distracted by... I understand the concern that talking to young people about sex and relationships might encourage them to engage in sexual behaviour. That's the concern that arises. But the evidence does not bear that out. It, in fact, shows the opposite over and over again.
What's that German word?
Oh, Ariel, you're going to have to pronounce it for me. I knew someone would ask me this. Yes. So there's
what he said.
there's a German word that I don't like pronouncing because I butcher it every time. And Ariel's tried to help. My husband's tried to help me practice it, but it means early sexualization, and basically, it's this idea that was deployed. It was deliberately wielded by conservative politicians in Germany as a means of opposing comprehensive relationships and sex ed and these kind of progressive efforts to guarantee young people, young Germans, access to this education. And it was this fear-mongering propaganda campaign, basically, that this was about encouraging kids to engage in sexual behaviour. It was encouraging them to be experimental with their sexuality. And it's just a dog whistle, basically, but it happens everywhere. And it's something that we have seen here, we will see as we continue on this journey. And it's just something we need to be prepared for.
Something that struck me reading about this part of your book and learning about this was how obvious it is, with even a touch of hindsight, that conservatives will use this subject as a tool, despite the fact that evidence shows the contrary. We know undeniably, it can never be repeated enough times, the more RSE you give young people, for example, the later in life they will become sexually active. That is data that has borne out repeatedly for many years now, and yet as soon as you start talking about this stuff, a light flickers on in the eyes of the right, and they just have such an easy, football to kick. How do you understand and how do you think about what Australia saw with safe schools? How do you make sense of that? Do you think that could happen again tomorrow, like the furore and the panic and the backpedaling?
So for those of you who aren't aware of what Safe Schools was and what happened with it, it was a program, it was effectively an anti-bullying program. It was about keeping young queer kids in schools safe. It had some sex ed components to it later on in its journey, but it wasn't actually a sex ed program. And yet, and yet the backlash was severe. It was riddled with mistruths, which is something we see overseas as well.
Why do you say mistruth instead of lie?
Lies is fine.
Okay, all right.
Lies is fine. But, you know, if, as I say in the book, if I had $1 for every time someone claims that a sex ed program is teaching kids how to have anal sex and how to masturbate, I don't know why the obsession with anal sex. Like, it's just all the time that's the thing that keeps cropping up. It's not true.
He doth protest too much.
That's what it is. But it's just, it comes up all the time. I saw it in Canada, I saw it in England, we see it here. And it's just not true that that's what these education programs are doing. But it's an easy, as you say, it's a bit of an easy tool. It gets people worked up. Your question was, do I see it? So with Safe Schools, it effectively got completely derailed because of this backlash. It was a very effective backlash. And that is a travesty given what it was doing to keep kids safe in schools. And that's a shame on our country, frankly. Do I see it happening again? At this point, I don't want to jinx it by saying this, but I don't think so. I think we've arrived at a different point. I think more people understand the importance of this information and this education for young people. They understand the protective power of it, and we are listening to young people more than I think we have before when they are calling out for this education. They're the ones asking for it. They know what they need to learn about, and we need to answer that call. And I think we're doing that a bit better than we have previously.
And I think in particular too, we are hearing the voices of either like current or recently graduated high school students who say that it was too late,
Yes.
which is so telling. I want to stick with this though, because with the sort of, not necessarily Safe Schools specifically, but the sort of backlash, can you explain how artificial it is to try and separate consent from relationships and sexuality education as a whole? And I can understand, the reason I want to flow on from Safe Schools into this is because I can understand how it might seem like an easy or tempting progression when we have seen such backlash to things like Safe Schools, which is so clearly homophobic and transphobic, that the answer could be to, instead of talking about relationships and sexuality education, to just talk about consent. But you speak so eloquently and clearly, I think, about how false that divide is.
So consent education as a name, and people have asked me before, can we not just call it consent education when what we're actually talking about is comprehensive relationships and sexuality education? Consent education as a name, it doesn't even have the word sex in it. That's why it's easier to talk about. That's why it's more palatable to politicians, to the community, because it doesn't seem to even touch on the idea of sex. And we will always have that sort of trigger response of fear around talking about sex to young people. But someone overseas described it to me as a deficit model if you're just talking to young people about consent. And what that means from a legalistic perspective. And Dr. Melissa Kang, who is in the room somewhere.
Oh, is she?
Yes.
Where's Melissa?
Oh, right here.
Hello. Can we get a big round of applause for Dr. Melissa Kang?
So Dr. Kang is former Dolly doctor, one of my absolute idols. And I was at a conference once with Melissa, who described the story of sex ed in Australia as one of reactionaryism. So it's risk averse. It's don't get an STI, don't get pregnant, don't get raped, or don't rape. It comes back to your...
Sometimes even leave the last one off.
Sometimes even leave the last one off. We may not even go there. And I think that's the best way of thinking of that kind of messaging. It's this reactionaryism. And it goes back to your earlier question about whether scare tactics work. And I think the way I talk about it in the book is, if you don't talk to young people, if you only tell them what they need to avoid and use no as their kind of northern star, You never tell them what they should be aiming for instead. So how do they know what a good relationship looks like, what a safe, healthy relationship looks like? What are red flags, but what are green flags? We always say you need to wait till you're ready. Well, what does that mean for me? How do I know if I feel ready? How do I have this conversation with the person that I'm interested in and I want to do this with them, but I don't want to do that with them? How do I have that conversation without being embarrassing, without making it awkward? How do I find out what someone else wants without killing the mood? These are the things that young people want practical answers to. That's what we hear over and over and over again. And you said this, young people are saying it was too late by the time they learned some of this stuff in high school. A colleague and friend of mine, Nina Fennell, and I, we sometimes go to universities and talk to university students about ethical bystander behaviour, consent, sexual wellbeing. And without fail, at every single session, one or more people will come up at the end and say, I wish we'd learned this at school. So just think about that. I wish we'd learned this at school. What is heartbreaking about that is that person is saying, I've had a moment in my life where I needed this information and I didn't have it. That might mean devastating consequences for some of those people. So I've forgotten the question.
It's all right. You answered it. So I remember... What are we doing wrong? Oh.
It's in my hair again.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Mic at faces. Yes. So I remember getting, or rather not getting, my sex ed from a nun. Sister Mary, who put our VHS tape into a giant television on wheels and then exited the room. So that was the thing. I want to know... Okay, there are two parts to this question. I'll ask you one first. Can you explain, I guess, the Catholic schools problem? And how, but specifically, how what you learned in Ireland disproves it.
Yes. So this is one of the questions I get a lot. You never get the Catholic schools on board. Hang on. And I want to start this by saying that I was raised Catholic. I started my education in the Catholic school system, so I have a bit of an understanding of, a bit of sort of lived experience, I suppose, of that education system in this country. And yes, it's true that I got no sex ed, but then again, I kind of left in primary school about the age that we start to talk to kids about sex ed. And yes, it's true that there are some barriers in terms of relationships and sexuality education and associated issues in the Catholic Church and the Catholic education system. But there are some excellent schools and teachers and education institutions in this country that are part of the Catholic education system trying to do really good work at giving their kids, their students, the education and information they need, balancing that against the pillars of their faith system that governs the education that they offer. And Ireland is such a good example because something I didn't realise until I got there, something in the realm of 90% of their schools are Catholic schools. It's a very Catholic country, or at least it has been historically so. But they, shortly before I got there on my Churchill Fellowship, they'd had a bit of a reckoning in a few areas, same-sex marriage, reproductive rights, and in sex ed. So they'd had this sort of national review of relationships and sexuality education, partly born out of a response to a high-profile rape case that was happening in Northern Ireland that got a lot of media attention, and there were these WhatsApp messages between the alleged perpetrators, and the way they were speaking about women and the victim was so shocking to the country that it sparked this national conversation about what are we teaching our young people that they could speak about women like that and behave in this way. And so they had this review of their sex ed program, and they came down quite hard on the conservative, or as I saw it in one document, outdated morals that governed the sex ed in that country, and they overhauled it. So I like to say that if Ireland can do it, we can do it too. And we are doing it. There are people in this country doing a really great job.
But, like you say, there are individual people doing great jobs. There undeniably are. You and I have both met dozens of them. But you also told me when we first ever spoke that the solution to this problem cannot be grassroots.
Yeah, it needs to be structural. And again, I say that with the caveat of I don't say that the government needs to come in, clear the field and stake a monopoly on relationships and sexuality education. But it needs to make it easier for grassroots organisations or individual teachers, individual schools, parents, community groups. It needs to make it easier for them to do this work, and it needs to make it harder to avoid doing this work.
Maybe let's talk about the government now.
Next this government?
Let's actually... what does it look like to try and get all of the separate states and territories on board, or can this leadership be shown by the federal government? Can you, what does that look like? If you could see the next step in that kind of structural big picture thing, how do you... It's so hard, even with schools funding, like what I've just finished doing so much research on. It's so hard to talk about, nationwide equality of, access to education when education is a state and territory power. How does that react with RSE?
Yeah. So let's start with the national curriculum. Recently it has been amended. It has a greater inclusion of consent, and with an asterisk next to that in terms of the concerns I've already raised about just focusing on consent. But consent is in there a bit more now in terms of the national curriculum. But that is just a guide, the national curriculum, and it doesn't speak to the need for teachers to balance so many other things in the curriculum that they have to talk to students about. It doesn't answer the need for teachers to be trained to feel confident in delivering this subject matter. It doesn't answer the need for parents to be engaged and have the resources and information they need. So the curriculum is one piece of the puzzle, and the reason I answer this question by starting there is because that is one way that it's very tempting to look at the curriculum and say, well, we've fixed it, we've made it better, that's it, job done. But
in your book you write that consent in the curriculum is politically low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, so for the first reason is because of what I said before about how it doesn't even have the word sex in it, so it's very palatable. And the second is because it's tempting to say, look, we've done something tangible, we've fixed this document that is meant to be the sort of guiding light for all schools around the country, and we can ignore the fact that it gets implemented in all different ways around the country, that not all states adopt it or deliver it in the same way, that it can be that the topic of sex ed can be avoided very easily, that it might be crammed into a 1 hour a year session. So it's tempting to kind of say, here's this solution, this national guiding light, but it doesn't actually answer so many of those needs. Going to perhaps a positive example of how it could be done differently, if you look at Germany, they have a number of different states, provinces, and education is a state responsibility in Germany as well, and yet it's their federal government that has created a branch in their federal public health department dedicated to sex education and sexual violence prevention. So they've created this sort of centralised group of experts who do domestic and international research that's quite cutting edge. They design programs, curricular resources. They help the states to roll it out through the education departments. So that's a really useful example, I think, for the kind of federalist system where education seems to be so fractured across a country, but you can still have that kind of leadership at the federal level.
And very telling as well that Germany puts it under the health department, right, instead of the education department.
In fact, a lot of countries do. Because coming back to that, what I was saying before about how they conceive of it as a matter of public health, education is the vehicle to answer that public health need, but it's a health issue. We in this country seem to see it as a justice issue, that prevention of sexual violence. If we just can, see it as this, if you know what consent is, then you won't commit sexual violence, which is not the whole answer. So focusing on it as a kind of justice response with a bit of education thrown in doesn't seem to work. Overseas, it's a health, education, child rights kind of framework, and that seems to be far more effective.
And it also just shifts it away from that deficit mindset. It's about learning about health, learning about bodies, learning about relationships, rather than how to avoid anything. Can we talk about the chicken and egg of parents and kids in terms of education about this stuff? I know when I get brought into schools, I feel like, and I know what I'm there to do, is that they can sort of parachute me in, I'll do the real talk, and then I leave, and if parents don't like it, it's fine because I'm gone. And I know that that's the role I get to play. To be fair, a lot of teachers feel like they can't. They would love to be able to say the things that I say, and they feel like they can't because they're afraid of the parent body reaction. And I hear from a lot of teachers telling me about terrible, frankly devastating attitudes from parents, and I hear from a lot of students, high school age students, about, they will ask me questions or tell me things and they say, I can't tell my mum or dad this because I know what they would say and it's XYZ, which is horrific. How do we build parental education into relationships and sexuality education, through the schools? What does that look like? Talk about that chicken and egg.
Yeah, so in the Netherlands they call it a triangle of education. So education of teachers, education of parents, and education of young people. And that triangle, if you hit all points on that triangle, and I would add a fourth corner and make it a square and talk about the rest of the community, because we all have a role to play. But in terms of trying to access all of those points, it's really important. And everywhere where they do sex ed well, they put a premium on engaging parents and caregivers. It's not a competition between school and home. It's a partnership. It's not about siloing responsibility either way. It's about bringing them together. And so all of these countries, they invest in things like resources for parents. So Rutgers in the Netherlands, they produce pamphlets that talk about, they produce pamphlets that talk about if your young person is this age, these are the kinds of questions you might start to get at this age. This is how you might answer them. Practical advice. They might have information sessions. So one of the private providers I spent time with in England, for every session they run with young people, they have a session with their parents beforehand explaining what they're going to talk to their young people about, why, and what kind of questions they might get when kids come home at the end of the day and how they might respond to those questions. So it is incorporating it in the school system, but it's much bigger than that. You need public health campaigns, you need sort of, as I say, resources, websites. It's a real infrastructure that they have overseas, whereas here we're just kind of like, here we'll do a consent class in this age group and we might talk to some parents over here. It's so haphazard, whereas overseas it's much more structured. And I think if we're going to get to that point, we need to recognise that it's a little bit more complicated and it's going to be more resource intensive than we might otherwise hope it to be, if we're going to actually get to the point where we're hitting all those points on the triangle or the square or the rhombus or whatever.
Beautiful.
Rhombus still has 4 points. My aunt's a maths teacher. I'm sorry, Ted.
I have one or two more questions for Katrina, and then we will go to audience questions. So if you've been thinking about something, please bring it to the fore of your mind. I want to finish with talking specifically about the fantastic book that you've written. Can you talk about the the structure. How can you explain how you go from the sort of vignettes to the explanation? What you hope that structure will achieve? Why you came up with that?
Yeah, sure. So it came about because the first iteration of the idea I think was a bit too dry. And it was suggested to me that it needed to be more narrative driven. And I didn't want to talk about real cases that I'd been involved in. I felt that there were some ethical issues with that. And I didn't want to end up in a place where I was just kind of rehashing people's trauma that had happened to them for the purposes of making several points. And I'm not saying that doesn't have, there isn't an ethical way of doing that and that doesn't have a place. It's just not what I wanted to do. So I decided to write fictional stories. At the start of each chapter, there's a short fictional vignette or case study and because they were fictional, I could actually manipulate them to make a point more effectively, perhaps, because I could make the characters do certain things or have certain sex education or lack thereof in their history, and it meant that I could make certain points with them. The sad thing is, though, that there are many of us who will recognise our own experiences in these chapters because the patterns, and this is where I think my experience in the criminal law is useful to this book, is because there are so many consistent features and themes and patterns that come up over and over again in sexual violence, negative sexual experiences, that there's a universality to these stories, I think. And it meant that I could write stories that many people will have, sadly, see their own experiences in. So then after the vignette there's a kind of breakdown of what has happened in that situation and how sex ed, comprehensive relationships and sexuality education might have changed that story, how it might have been different for the people in that situation for the better.
There's a line you have in the book about I put it down here, that sexual violence is very dark and dangerous yet very ordinary. And that is very much the vibe I got from every single vignette in this book, is that these scenarios have obviously devastating consequences for the people involved and yet happen every single day to hundreds and thousands of people. My final question for you, I want to finish on a positive note. When did the book officially come out? Like a day ago? What it was like really? Anyway, we're already seeing responses from teachers reading it, from just people reading it. I mean, what, in your wildest dreams, what do you hope this book might achieve? What might it contribute to? Less feedback in the microphone.
I would like to see this country recognise that every young Australian has a right to access comprehensive relationships and sexuality education, and for us to meet that right. That's what I want.
Okay, great. We will go to audience questions now. I will do the annoying job of repeating your question for the people watching at home, please.
Maybe you can repeat it better than I can ask.
Tall order, all right.
I'm interested, Katrina, in the countries you've visited with positive sex ed programs, has there been any connection yet with the volume of cases coming through the criminal justice system? So getting back to the beginning of where you've started and what you're trying to address.
Okay, so the question was whether there's been any correlation between the countries who have great like RSE programs and caseload of sex crime volume, etc., whether those things correspond in any way you've been.
One important thing that needs to be said is that comprehensive relationships and sexuality education isn't a silver bullet for sexual violence prevention. It's not going to prevent every rape. There are so many different causes that come into the mix. But what we do know, and you can take the Netherlands as an example, and in parts of the US as well, there's research that shows that the more young people are exposed to comprehensive RSE, the less likely they will have negative sexual experiences. And that term negative sexual experiences captures a really wide range of things, including sexual violence. There is sort of the reason that we don't just limit it to sexual violence is because Well, one reason is that a lot of young people don't necessarily characterise some of their experiences as sexual violence, but they may not be wanted or...
Can you just...
Yep.
A useful term I have learned in the last few years is like unwanted sex.
Yeah.
Can you... Yeah, sorry, you were about to say anyway, but these sort of, softer terms that are actually really important for when talking to young people?
Yeah, they're important because, as I say, young people themselves may not characterise some of these things as sexual violence, and some of these things won't be legally understood as sexual violence, and some of them shouldn't be legally understood as sexual violence if we're thinking of, for example, engaging in sexual behaviour because of a broader peer pressure to be sexually active. That's not necessarily coming from directly the other person in a sexual encounter, but it's still a pressure that might bear down on someone in the room, and they may engage in sexual activity when they don't really want to. So that's why I use the term unwanted sex that's used in surveys like the National Survey of Secondary Students and Sexual Health, for example, to capture something that's outside what might legally be understood as sexual violence, because if we're too narrow in our focus, we miss a lot of what sits on that spectrum that ends up at sexual violence. We need to consider the whole spectrum, otherwise we'll never fix this end of it.
Another question? Surely. Yes, at the back there.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the role of mainstream sexist pornography in perpetuating harmful norms around sex. I'm sure you're aware that lots of surveys say that young adults view quite a bit of that sort of pornography, and that surveys in the US say that they partly view it in order to learn how to have sex. And so I'm wondering, what your thoughts about that are.
So the question was about pornography, which we didn't get to, but you do deal with in the book, about how you see that affecting young people's sex education, and I guess damaging, etc.
So the challenge that I think I pose in the book about this subject matter is to consider that any perils of pornography are not so much in the noise that it contributes, as I say in the book, but the silence that it might occupy. So pornography and the issues we might have with it, some of the heteronormative, cisnormative, racist, ableist, sexist issues that might crop up in porn are not somehow separate from those things in what we might consider more innocuous places. So my challenge to us is to consider how those things are born of the attitudes that we hold in what we might consider more innocuous parts of our community. They might be really, the dial might be really turned up in pornography. It might be more accessible. It might be more in your face, but it draws its inspiration from the rest of the world. So you see some of these things on social media as well, in film, in literature, in TV shows, in pop culture. It's not just pornography. So I want us to actually consider where those things come from more broadly than pornography. But yes, we know that young people are seeking out information online. They may get some of their sex ed online through things like pornography. And again, what the role that sex ed can play is helping young people make sense of those messages that they're getting. So if they do see these things, and they will, when they see them, they have a bit of a framework of values that we have given them to place those messages into. So again, I want to consider porn not so much the noise it contributes, but the silence that it fills. We're creating that silence. How can we, as I say, create a framework that it can fall into?
The last time I had to look up these stats, I think it was 11, was the age at which most young people either have sought out or been exposed to pornography for the first time.
Yeah,
and
it's
when
low double digits.
Yeah, low double digits. And when you say that to parents, cannot fathom, but I find it's quite a strong argument that, wouldn't you rather the first time your child either seeks it out or is presented with it without seeking it out, wouldn't you rather that they have already been equipped with the toolkit to understand it, rather than that be some of the first intense visuals, first themes that they ever see. Do you feel, though, that, this is supposed to be audience question time, I have one more. Do you think that porn sometimes gets put in the kind of silver bullet basket, and it's sort of, sometimes I feel like the way it's spoken about gets put in this other section, and that we can demonize it, and if only we could somehow stop young people accessing porn, then they wouldn't be so bad?
Yeah, I think we put it in the scapegoat basket.
Yes, that's the word I was
It's it's porn's fault, which is why I say that can we consider where those messages are coming from, though, because a lot of the things we might have concerns about, you can watch a film and you'll see the same messages, maybe not so graphically, but they're going to be there. And I agree with your comments that someone in Ireland said it to me in this way: young people are going to find this information, they're going to get this information, and if we've been silent on it, we've missed the chance to give them the values we want them to have when they encounter this information, this whether it's in porn or on social media. There's a whole lot of stuff about choking and rough sex on Instagram all the time. It's not just, you don't have to go to RedTube or whatever.
We have time for probably 2 more audience questions. I'm sure they're out there. Yes, please.
I like your optimism with the general consensus of Australia's educational landscape shifting. So I'm going to start with that. As a high school educator, I understand the community's response is to lump it all on us. That's my first part. So, having read Jess Hill's book and knowing the atrocities around Australia and domestic violence that are happening at the moment, the public perception has shifted, and that's great. The dialogue has changed. Your book was about education and how the systems are divided. Now, coming into our context now in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, we've got heavy, hard-hitting conservatives fronting the educational reform of our syllabus. Realistically, how long do you think it will take for that to take hold, the optimism, and for it to become a systematic thing?
So the question came from a high school educator whose question is related to this division of private Catholic and public schools.
As well as the conservative push that's currently happening in our curriculum. From Mark Latham is heading the educational reform.
Mark Latham is currently heading up educational reform. How do you have the optimism that you described this evening?
In New South Wales.
In New South Wales, specifically.
He's a state senator.
Because I think the weight of community sentiment is against, I don't want to say him personally, maybe that too, but that perspective, the weight of community sentiment is turning. There's been really recent research, some of which I've been involved in that hasn't been published yet, that shows that the majority of parents around this country want better sex ed for their kids. Something in the realm of 80-90% of parents.
When's that coming out?
Soon. But there's also been research that is published, I think, out of the University of Western Sydney perhaps, that shows that parents are really supportive of more inclusive sex ed. So the weight of community sentiment is turning. It will take time. The other thing that gives me hope is that all of these countries I went to overseas, they're not like these utopias where they're just, everyone was like, great, sex ed is awesome from day one. They have this backlash too. They just meet it more effectively than we do. We run away from it. They meet it. There was a former Premier of Ontario, she's a great example, I talk about her in the book. She campaigned on a platform of better sex ed, and she was obliterated at the next election. And she had some really useful insight about what she would have done differently to meet that opposition. And her successor was from the conservative side of politics. He campaigned on a platform to roll back. Let's go back to the 1998 sex ed where we don't talk about queer issues at all. I don't even know if the internet was a thing back then. So,
Neopets.
Yeah. So, but then there was a huge outcry in response to that as well. So we're seeing this tension take place, and I think no longer do those who oppose sex ed have the currency that they once did, and we are seeing the tide turn. It will take time though. It's not going to be fixed in the next couple of years. But I am, going back to your first question, one of the first questions, I'm heartened by how sustained the attention has been on this issue. I thought by the time I finished writing this and it came out that no one would be interested in sex ed anymore, it'd be off the airwaves, but it's not. People are still really interested in this issue, so I think if we just keep that focus and we take heart from the fact that most people in the community are on board and we listen to that rather than the noisy naysayers, we'll get there.
We have time for one more. I will allow. I'm sure there is one more in the room. Yes, red shirt.
Okay. You said at the beginning your research was a deficiency in that it focused on Eurocentric countries and North American countries. Is there space in what you see as the future of sex ed for more intersectionality? I'm thinking like Indigenous women in Australia and Canada, and how that's presented to kids in high school.
So the question, the question you mentioned earlier, and something that you do discuss in the book, is how Eurocentric your Churchill Fellowship was. The question was about room for more intersectionality, potentially Indigenous perspectives, etc. in RSE.
Absolutely. There's a great article in The Conversation that came out earlier this year, authored by Amanda Sivasato, who talks about the need for, in the context of talking about consent education, the need for First Nations voices and meaningful co-design. So not just co-design where we're saying, we've consulted First Nations people, but actual meaningful co-design in terms of both content and delivery of relationships and sexuality education. I also quote a wonderful young sexologist and sexuality educator, Lauren French, who is a First Nations woman, and she talks about how in the Western understanding of education, we really sit it in these sort of formal institutions, and we conceive of it through things like the curriculum. But there might be all these informal places that education is occurring, particularly for example, young First Nations people in yarning circles and those sorts of things. So considering that aspect is really crucial if we're to make sure that relationships and sexuality education is effective for all young Australians. And there's also a chapter in the book that talks about, if we're talking about inclusivity, the need for relationships and sexuality education to be inclusive of people with disabilities and neurodivergent young people. They're often left out of sex ed because it's too hard, or that they won't understand, or it's a really sort of paternalistic approach, which isn't empowering, which is what relationships and sex ed needs to be. So the need for it to be inclusive and intersectional is critical if it's to be at all effective.
Thank you. Dan's going to do a proper wrap-up, but before he does, I just want to say I feel like with hindsight we can see that most social movements are, marathons instead of sprints, and each one takes not only dozens of events, a domino effect of dozens of events to take hold, but that also these movements are run by people, and that if you want to go far, you go together. And I think that with what you've achieved with your book, you are a critical domino, and I know from knowing you and valuing you as a friend that you are part of a team of people who very much respect and appreciate you. And thank you for putting the work in that has resulted in this fantastic book, Legitimate Sexpectations.
Thank you.